The breeze from Bayview Cove hinted at the approaching evening, carrying with it the scent of salty water and a faint touch of nostalgia. Jonathan Haynes stood by the window of his home, watching as the last rays of the setting sun painted the horizon in a crimson gold hue. This city was more than just a place to live for him. It was a sanctuary where life flowed smoothly and the world's problems seemed to stay beyond its borders. Laughter from his wife Alice echoed through the living room. Her voice was as gentle as ever, but it carried notes that he had long considered a sign of absolute happiness. She was talking to their friends, Cameron and Julie, frequent guests in their home. The sound of pouring wine, the clinking of glasses, and carefree laughter created an atmosphere of peace and comfort that made Jonathan feel at home. But on this evening, despite the tranquility of the moment, Jonathan couldn't shake a strange feeling. It was like an itch at the edge of his consciousness, as if something invisible was whispering to him, "Be alert." He had noticed for several weeks that Alice had become a bit more withdrawn. Not so much that others would notice, but he, knowing her like the back of his hand, saw the little things, the prolonged gaze at her phone, the slight delay in her response, as if she were rehearsing what to say in her mind. "Jonathan, are you asleep over there?" Her voice pulled him out of his thoughts. No, just watching the sun go down," he replied, turning around and catching her warm smile. Alice looked stunning. Her chestnut hair, slightly curled at the ends, cascaded over her shoulders, and her dress accentuated her slender figure. She always knew how to be herself, and that was one of the reasons he loved her so much. "Come on, stop dreaming. We decided to go out tonight, remember? The Harpoon Bar." "Everyone is already waiting," she said, raising her glass as if proposing a toast. The Harpoon was an old bar located right by the water. Its creaky wooden floors, dim lighting, and persistent smell of seafood created an atmosphere that the locals adored. The bar was almost full when Jonathan and his group entered. Conversations, the clinking of glasses, and bursts of laughter filled the air. Everything looked familiar, almost too familiar. They took a table by the window, overlooking the pier. The men discussed the upcoming football match, while the women talked about the latest events in town. Jonathan caught Alice's gaze as she laughed at another of Julie's jokes. Her eyes sparkled with joy, but at that moment, he noticed something. It was insignificant but persistent. Her gaze flicked to the side, where two men stood at the bar counter. They stood out even in such a lively place. One of them, tall with a well-groomed beard and a relaxed demeanor, leaned against the counter, sipping whiskey as if observing the room. The other, more muscular and aggressive, constantly moved between tables, chatting with one group after another. He had an arrogance in his movements that instantly drew attention. "Do you see that?" Jonathan quietly asked Cameron, nodding in their direction. Cameron turned and slightly frowned. "Those two? Looks like they're searching for someone. Maybe it's a new way to sell something illegal," he joked, returning to his drink. But Jonathan couldn't just brush it off. The man moving through the room was getting closer to their table. His smile was wide, but there was something unsettling about it. When he was just a few steps away, Jonathan felt his heart quicken. "Hey, guys," the stranger began, addressing their group. His voice was low but friendly. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" "Yes, quite," Cameron responded, but his tone was clearly guarded. The stranger nodded as if they were all old friends. "We're in town for a short while, and my friend is looking for company tonight. I must say, your table is the brightest spot in this place, especially you, ladies." At that moment, Jonathan felt something click inside him. He waited for Alice or Julie to refuse, but instead, Alice looked at the stranger, her eyes slightly narrowed, as if evaluating his words. "That's quite bold," she said, smiling, but with a hint of mockery. "And how exactly does your friend envision this company?" The man smirked and turned to his companion, who had been watching the scene from a distance the whole time. "I assure you he won't disappoint. You'll see for yourselves if you want to." For a moment, an awkward silence hung over the table. Jonathan didn't know what bothered him more, the stranger's audacity or how naturally Alice reacted to his words. Something was off, and although he didn't yet understand what, a premonition was already growing inside him that this evening would be a turning point in his life. The Harpoon Bar continued its noisy existence. The clinking of glasses, laughter, and conversations blended into a single hum, hiding the tension that now settled at Jonathan's table. The stranger, like an experienced hunter, took a step back, as if giving everyone time to digest his proposal. His confidence was almost frightening. He knew he had made a move that wasn't easy to ignore. Jonathan looked at Alice. Her face appeared relaxed, but her fingers nervously twisted the wine glass, as if it helped her concentrate. He wanted to ask her what she thought, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he looked at Cameron, hoping he would find a way to quickly end this awkward moment. "Buddy, you chose the wrong table," Cameron finally said, pushing his glass away and standing up to position himself between the stranger and the women. His voice was firm, his gaze warning. "Find yourself another company." The stranger showed no sign of embarrassment. He slightly tilted his head, as if considering a possible response. "I respect your resolve," he said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "But this is just a friendly offer. I didn't mean to offend anyone." His eyes returned to Alice. His gaze was direct but not overtly challenging. It was more of a challenge than an attempt to offend. She smiled, a light, almost weightless smile that Jonathan had never seen before. "A friendly offer," she repeated, as if tasting the words. "Interesting." "Alice," Jonathan began, but his voice was soft, almost choked. She turned to him, her face now a mix of surprise and irritation. "It's okay, John," she said softly, but with a note of reproach. "This is just a conversation." But Jonathan knew her too well. This was not just a conversation. This was a moment when she consciously chose her reaction. He felt it with every fiber of his being, but there was nothing he could do to stop what was happening. Soon after the stranger left, the atmosphere at the table eased somewhat, but the tension remained in the air. Alice and Julie discussed local news, pretending nothing had happened, but Cameron kept casting suspicious glances at the counter where both men still sat. Jonathan tried to fit into the general mood, but thoughts of the stranger wouldn't leave him. After a while, Alice stood up from the table. "I need to go outside, get some fresh air," she said, taking her purse. "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." Jonathan instinctively reached out to her. "Do you want me to come with you?" he asked, but she just shook her head. No, I'll be fine on my own. It's okay." He watched her disappear through the bar door. Something in her stride, that almost demonstrative confidence, caused him concern, but he decided not to follow her to avoid causing a scene. However, after a few minutes, when her absence became too long, he couldn't sit still any longer. "I'll go out and see if everything is okay," he said to Cameron, standing up. "Maybe that's not the best idea." His friend tried to stop him, but Jonathan was already heading for the exit. The street behind the bar was almost deserted. A light wind rustled the sign, which creaked under its gusts. The light from the street lamps cast long shadows stretching to the bar's doors. Jonathan slowly looked around, feeling the muffled hum of music and conversations inside. His gaze caught figures in the far corner of the parking lot. Alice was facing one of those men, the very one, silent, who had been sitting there all this time. She was saying something to him, her hand gestures energetic, but she seemed calm. Jonathan approached closer, his steps becoming softer, though he himself did not understand why. It was a reflex, as if he did not want to be noticed. When he got close enough to distinguish voices, he heard the stranger say, "Are you sure? This is not an easy decision." "I'm sure," Alice replied, her voice resolute. "It's just one evening. It won't change anything." The words echoed in Jonathan's head. Just one evening. Won't change anything. He couldn't believe his ears. He took another step, but at that moment, the stranger looked up and met his gaze. His face showed no surprise, only a calm, almost condescending smile. Alice turned around. There was something on her face that he couldn't understand. It was a look he had never seen before. "John," she said, her voice filled with something strange that he couldn't define. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." His voice trembled, but he tried to maintain his composure. Alice hesitated, as if searching for the right words. The stranger, seemingly comfortable, as if he already knew how this conversation would end. "It's okay," she finally said. "We were just talking." But Jonathan knew it was a lie. He felt it. And at that moment, standing under the flickering light of the street lamp, he realized that his life would never be the same again. The cold night air hit Jonathan in the face, but he barely noticed it. His gaze was fixed on Alice, her figure seeming unreal under the dim light of the street lamp. Next to her stood the stranger, tall and confident, as if this situation was part of his usual routine. Alice's words, "We were just talking," echoed in Jonathan's head, but they seemed empty, lifeless. He saw her, saw them, and there was nothing ordinary about it. "Talking?" he repeated, his voice hoarse, as if from prolonged silence. "Alice, what's going on?" She stood, interlocking her fingers, as if about to say something, but not finding the right words. Her eyes avoided his gaze, looking instead at the road, at the man beside her, anywhere but at Jonathan. The stranger, on the other hand, looked completely calm. His posture, slight smirk, lack of tension, all of it irritated Jonathan to the point of pain in his chest. "It's not what you think, John," Alice finally said. Her voice was too quiet, almost apologetic. She took a step forward, but not too close. I wanted some time for myself. I wanted something new. You understand?" He didn't understand. None of what she said made sense to him. She spoke about it as if their marriage was just a convenient shell that she could take off and put on whenever she wanted. "New?" he repeated, his voice now sharper, as if he was tasting the words and finding them repulsive. "And you decided that new could be found like this? Meeting someone outside the bar?" Alice looked away, her shoulders slumping as if this conversation was an unbearable burden for her. But Jonathan felt differently. Her gestures, her words, it all looked not like remorse, but like justification, an attempt to rationalize her actions to him. "It doesn't mean anything, John," she said, finally turning to him. There was a mix of desperation and strange defiance in her eyes. "It's just an evening. It's just, emotions." The word emotions made him freeze. His thoughts raced through his mind. Emotions? What kind of emotions? Desire? Intrigue? He looked at her, his heart pounding wildly, and a pain growing in his chest as if something was tearing apart inside him. "Emotions?" he said, and this time his voice broke. "You're talking about emotions. But what about us? Our marriage? What about them?" Her face hardened for a moment, but then softened, and she took a step toward him. Her hand reached out to his, but he stepped back, as if her touch could burn him. "John, I love you," she said. Her voice was almost pleading, but there was too little sincerity in it for him to believe it. "This doesn't change anything between us." He felt a surge of anger. Nothing changes? How could she say that? How could she stand there with this stranger and claim that their marriage remained the same? "You say nothing changes?" he said, his voice now louder, almost thunderous. "Alice, you're standing here with another man, and I'm supposed to pretend everything is okay? How can you think nothing changes?" Alice stepped back, her face paling. The stranger, who had been silent until now, finally intervened. "Hey, buddy," he said, raising his hands. "Let's not make this more complicated. This was her decision. She's an adult." Those words were the final straw. Jonathan stepped forward, his fist clenched, but the stranger was quicker. He raised his hands as if anticipating an attack. "Don't," he said with a hint of contempt in his voice. "You don't want to make a scene here." "A scene?" Jonathan shouted. "You think this is a scene? You barged into my life, my marriage, and you call this a scene?" His voice trembled, and his anger reached its peak. He couldn't believe this was happening, that his wife, the woman he loved more than anything in the world, allowed this to happen. Alice tried to intervene again. "John, please, let's talk about this later," she said, her voice now barely audible. "This is not the place for this." "Later," he repeated, stunned by her words. "Alice, here and now, I want to understand what's happening and why you think this is normal." In response, she just looked at him silently, and that look was the most painful. There was no remorse, no repentance, only fatigue and a strange resolve, as if she had already decided everything for herself. The stranger, seemingly tired of waiting, took a step back and, addressing Alice, said, "You know where to find me if you change your mind." With those words, he turned and headed back to the bar, leaving Jonathan and Alice alone. She looked after him, but then turned her gaze to her husband. There was sadness in her eyes, but it seemed distant, as if she no longer belonged to this moment. Jonathan couldn't bear her silence any longer. He turned and walked back to the bar, his steps quick and heavy. He felt broken, destroyed. His marriage, his life, everything was crumbling before his eyes, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. Jonathan drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white. The moonlight filtering through the tree branches flickered on the windshield, as if nature itself was teasing him with those light flashes. The car was the only place where he could be alone with his thoughts. But tonight, those thoughts were devastating. I love you. It doesn't change anything. Her words echoed in his head like a stuck record. How could they not change anything? She stood there with another man, talking about something new, as if their relationship could just be paused. At home, Jonathan paused at the door, momentarily frozen. Their home, their cozy refuge, now felt foreign, just like Alice. His hands trembled as he inserted the key into the lock, but when he opened the door, he felt only emptiness. Alice hadn't returned yet. He walked into the living room, leaving things scattered, and sat on the couch. The silence of the house weighed on him. He looked at the photos on the wall, the two of them at the beach, their wedding day, a Christmas dinner with friends. All those moments that had seemed so important now looked like lies. His phone vibrated, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Cameron. "John, where are you? We saw you leave." His voice was concerned. "Home," Jonathan replied briefly. "Are you okay? What happened?" Jonathan fell silent. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he explain that his life had crumbled in one evening? "No, Cam, not okay," he finally said. "Alice, I don't know what's happening with her." "Damn," Cameron exhaled. "Do you want us to come over?" "No," Jonathan shook his head, though his friend couldn't see him. "I want to figure this out on my own." Cameron didn't insist, but offered to stay in touch. Jonathan put down the phone and was alone again. Later that night, the front door slammed, and Jonathan heard Alice's footsteps. She entered the living room, her face tired but calm. She saw him and paused, as if trying to gauge what to expect. "You're not asleep?" she asked, as if nothing had happened. "How can you be so calm?" Jonathan stood up, his voice trembling with suppressed emotions. "After everything that happened, you just come home as if nothing happened?" Alice looked down and sighed. "John, I don't want to fight. I think we need time to think about everything." "Time?" He laughed, but there was no joy in that laughter. "You want time to think about whether to ruin everything we've built?" Alice raised her hands as if defending herself. "I'm not ruining anything, John. I don't know how to explain. I need something new, something to make me alive." Those words hurt Jonathan the most. He felt like he had been thrown out of her world. She no longer saw him as part of her life. "Alive," he repeated, struggling to hold back tears. "And what about me? Did you think about how this makes me feel?" Alice fell silent. There was a mix of desperation and challenge in her eyes, but she said nothing. Instead, she went to the bedroom, leaving Jonathan in the silence. He sat in the living room, his gaze fixed on the floor. The pain that had been tearing him apart inside now turned into icy resolve. The next day, Jonathan decided he couldn't live in ignorance any longer. He called his friend Mark, who worked at a private detective agency. "Mark, I need your help," he said when his friend picked up. "Of course, John. What's going on?" "I want to know who these people are. Those two from the bar. They're hiding something, and I need to know what." Mark didn't ask unnecessary questions. He was a man of action, and Jonathan knew he could rely on him. A couple of hours later, Mark called back. "John, this is interesting. Those two aren't locals, but they visit Bayview quite often. Their names are Daniel Harris and Lucas Brown. They're registered at different hotels, always briefly. They have a reputation. Let's say they break up couples, especially those where the wives seem unhappy." "What?" Jonathan felt his heart stop. "Are you saying this is their job?" "Possibly," Mark cautiously replied. "They use their charm and charisma to make connections, and then, well, you get the idea. This is unofficial information, but I've heard that some husbands filed for divorce after their appearance." Mark's words hit Jonathan like a hammer. Everything fell into place. This wasn't just a random encounter, it was deliberate. They had chosen Alice. Thanks, Mark, he exhaled. If you find out anything else, let me know. He hung up and felt a wave of anger wash over him. Alice had become their victim, but her choice was also conscious. Now he knew that his life would never be the same again. That night, Jonathan sat in the darkness of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling. His heart was torn between love and betrayal, and his mind was planning how to fix what had been broken. One thing he knew for sure, he wasn't going to lose. Morning came slowly, as if nature itself resisted the start of a new day. Jonathan woke up after a restless night, his thoughts foggy, his emotions a raw mix of pain, anger, and emptiness. Alice was already gone from home. This didn't even surprise him. She had been leaving more and more often without explanation, and Jonathan understood that control over his life was slipping away. But today was different. He had decided he couldn't be a passive observer anymore. His heart was broken, but his mind was cold and focused. He wasn't going to let those people, Daniel and Lucas, get away with it. And he wasn't going to let Alice ruin what they had built together without realizing what she was doing. Jonathan called Mark. "Did you find out anything else?" he asked, not bothering with a greeting. "Yes," Mark replied, his voice serious. "Those two, Daniel and Lucas, operate on a specific scheme. They choose small towns like Bayview, where people are relaxed and trusting. They find couples where the wives, in their opinion, are in an emotional crisis and offer new experiences." Jonathan listened, clenching his teeth. "And then what?" "Then they disappear," Mark continued. "They leave before the problems start, leaving the couples to deal with the consequences. I found several cases in neighboring towns. They all have the same story: broken marriages, traumatized people, and these two who never return." "Where are they now?" Jonathan interrupted him. "At a hotel on the outskirts of town," Mark replied. "I can send you the address." "Do it," Jonathan replied. His voice was as cold as steel. The hotel where Daniel and Lucas were staying looked unremarkable. An old 3-story building with peeling paint. Jonathan sat in his car watching the entrance. His thoughts were racing, from hatred toward those two to questions about whether he could ever forgive Alice. He waited for several hours until he saw Daniel exit the hotel, carrying a bag in his hand. He headed toward a nearby SUV, his movements relaxed and confident. Jonathan got out of his car, his heart pounding, but his face remained expressionless. "Daniel Harris," he said, approaching the man. Daniel turned, surprised, but quickly regained his composure. "Yes, and who are you?" he asked, his voice steady, but his eyes showed a hint of wariness. "The husband of one of those women you like to work with," Jonathan replied, his voice filled with anger. Daniel smirked, but there was tension in his expression. "Listen, buddy, I don't know what you're talking about. We're just hanging out with friends. If you have problems, that's not my business." "Not your business?" Jonathan stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You don't realize what you're doing. You're ruining families, playing with people's lives. And now you're telling me it's not your business?" Daniel raised his hands as if surrendering. "Calm down, buddy. Nobody's forcing anyone. Everyone makes their own choices. If your wife decided to try something, that's her business, not mine." Those words were the last straw. Jonathan grabbed Daniel by the collar and pushed him against the car door. His face was just inches away from Daniel's. "This is not just her choice. You manipulate people, take advantage of their weakness. You think I'll let you get away with this?" he hissed. Daniel, realizing the situation was out of control, said, Okay, listen, I didn't mean any harm. It's just business." "Business?" Jonathan pushed him away with such force that he hit his back against the car. "I'll show you what consequences look like." At that moment, Lucas emerged from the hotel, clearly on guard. Seeing the scene, he froze, then quickly approached them. "Hey, what's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm. "This is that husband I was talking about," Daniel said, rubbing his neck. Lucas assessed the situation and stepped closer. "Listen, friend, you'd better leave before things get worse. You won't achieve anything." But Jonathan didn't move. His anger was boiling, but now it was focused. He understood that fighting them wouldn't change anything, but he couldn't let them walk away as if nothing had happened. "You're both parasites," he said, looking at them with contempt. You play with people's lives, but this time you picked the wrong person. He took a step back, his gaze cold and determined. I won't fight you, but know this. You won't get away with it so easily. I'll find a way to stop you. Jonathan turned and walked back to his car, leaving them standing in the parking lot. He knew that the fight with them was just the beginning. The real battle lay ahead, the battle to restore himself and his life after everything that had happened. A month had passed since that night when Jonathan confronted Daniel and Lucas. Time felt like an eternity, filled with struggle, searching for answers and trying to understand what to do next. His world would never be the same, but he knew the destruction had to be stopped. After their confrontation, Jonathan decided to take a different approach. With Mark's help, he gathered evidence against Daniel and Lucas. Photos, video recordings, testimonies from other victims. It all came together to paint a convincing picture of their manipulative activities. In one of the interviews, Jonathan learned that these two didn't just destroy families. They blackmailed some women to keep them silent, threatening to ruin their reputations. Mark helped Jonathan contact the police. Although there wasn't enough direct evidence for a criminal case, they found a loophole: tax violations and the use of fake documents for hotel registrations. This became the beginning of the end for Lucas and Daniel. Within a few weeks, they were arrested, and information about their activities made it into the local news. Jonathan felt relief, but this was only the first step. Their punishment wouldn't bring back his old life, but it would stop others from suffering. Alice had moved in with her friend a few days after that fateful night. They hadn't spoken since, and Jonathan decided not to seek her out. Her choice had been made, and he respected that. One day she did call. Her voice was soft and, for the first time in a long time, sincere. John, I want to apologize, she began. I understand what I've done. I've ruined everything we had. It's my fault. That's true, Alice, he replied, struggling to hold back the anger that still burned inside him. But you were also a part of our life. And if you're ready to take responsibility, I can accept your apology. I don't know if I can regain your trust, she confessed, but I want you to know, I still love you. Jonathan fell silent. Her words sounded sincere, but he already knew that trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. Alice, love isn't just words, it's actions. And sometimes actions speak louder than any apologies. I wish you happiness, but we need to move forward separately. Her response was filled with sadness, but she agreed. That was their last conversation. Justice had been served, but for Jonathan, it was just the beginning. He quit his job at the law firm and started doing what he had long dreamed of, opening a small restaurant on the Bayview coast. He named it Sales, symbolizing a new beginning and freedom. His friends, including Cameron and Mark, supported him every step of the way. Together, they created a cozy place that quickly became popular among the locals. Jonathan found not just a new purpose, but also a new meaning in life. One evening, Jonathan stood by the window of his new home, watching the sun set over the bay. The wind gently rustled the curtains, and the scent of the sea filled the air. He no longer felt that sharp pain that had tormented his heart for months. It had turned into a gentle, barely noticeable shadow, reminding him of the past. Someone knocked on the door. It was Sophie, one of the local artists who often visited the restaurant. Her bright smile and light, carefree laughter always lifted his spirits. I hope I'm not intruding, she asked, holding a bottle of wine. I thought good company is better than being alone. Jonathan smiled. He realized that for the first time in a long time, he felt happy. Not perfect, not flawless, but real. You're right, he replied, letting her in. Let's start this evening with something new. The sun had fully set, leaving behind a warm glow. Life went on, and Jonathan was ready to face it with an open heart.